Brother Thomas is a Capuchin friar of the province of St. Augustine. He's assistant professor of historical and systematic theology at the Catholic University of America. His research focuses on the Franciscan intellectual tradition, in particular, the figure and writings of St. Francis of Assisi and the theology of St. Bonaventure. Thematically, much of his most recent and ongoing scholarship explores topics related to pneumatology, so the theology of the Holy Spirit, and Trinitarian theology. Brother Thomas also has the unique distinction of being my classmate. So I've had to practice some pretty great restraint in putting an introduction together for Brother Tommy. So Brother Tommy hails from the great state, come on in, from the great state of Ohio, OH. And besides being a distinguished theologian with more letters behind his name than the alphabet, he is versed in many things, including 90s rock drumming, making tiramisu that could serve as rocket fuel, and from my understanding, since his time in Italy, has become quite the Italian chef, which is something that I'm still waiting to validate. Brother Tommy came to the Capuchins by way of the Jesuits, studying at St. Louis University, where he had the opportunity to study the writings of St. Francis with one of the Franciscan intellectual giants of our day, Father Wayne Hellman. I'm very grateful that he did. He fell in love with the writings of and vision of St. Francis, and because of this, we're very blessed to have Tommy as a Capuchin brother, not as a Jesuit. So this is an absolute joy to be able to welcome Brother Tommy and have him break open St. Bonaventure's life of St. Francis for us. So with that, we turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ross. That was a very kind introduction. I was a little nervous when I found out that my classmate was going to be introducing me, because who knows what he would have said after living with me for more than just a few years. Um, but I'm really honored to be here. Albeit virtually. I'm honored that he invited me to do this. I'm so thankful that the church is honoring the 800th anniversary of the death of St. Francis, and that we're taking this opportunity, hopefully, to learn more about him so that this great saint might inspire us. I also have to acknowledge the fact that Brother Bill Henn is in the room. Brother Bill was one of my professors when I was a student at the Gregorian University, and it's really humbling giving a talk when he is in the audience. For those of you who haven't had the opportunity or the honor of meeting Brother Bill, he's really quite an exemplary figure in the province. He's given his life to the order as a theologian, serving the church in Rome, and trying to be as faithful as possible and enlivened and inflamed by Christ's prayer that they may be one. He's given his life working for the unity of Christians. So it's Bill, it's an honor to have you in here as your former student. All right, so the lecture series is entitled St. Bonaventure's Life of Theology, Life of St. Francis, a Theology. This first lecture, one of three, is simply entitled Introducing Bonaventure's Major Legend. So the life that Bonaventure wrote of St. Francis is called the Major Legend. But I have to admit, before we get into Bonaventure's Major Legend, before we get into the text, I'm going to begin this lecture series with a fairly substantial introduction. I want to do two things in this introduction. I want to reflect briefly with you on the significance of saints, the significance of why we might want to read the life of a saint. And then I want to say a few words about what's called hagiography. So when you look at Bonaventure's Major Legend, the genre is called hagiography. It's not quite a biography, it's a hagiography. And I'll say a word of what that means. After all of that, provided that there's still some time, I'm going to start saying something about the Major Legend itself. Okay, so let's begin. The significance of saints and hagiography. In her book, which was published in 1950, Ida Friederike Görres, a German theologian who died in 1971, she asks the question. She entertains the following question. Why do I devote myself so zealously to studying the saints? This question strikes me 70 plus years later as just as relevant. I mean, I wonder how easy it must be for a non-Catholic, or perhaps a Catholic who hasn't been catechized, to wonder about what Catholics do with all of this saint business. Why do we venerate the saints? Why do we have icons and statues of the saints? Why do we read about the saints? Why do we pray to the saints? It all seems quite strange. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who has been asked, why don't you just go straight to God? Why bother yourself with the saints? Why not just go straight to God? Okay, so here's how Gores responds to the question. It's quotation number 1 on your handout. For me, the saint is the most important person, not only in the church. The saint is the most important person in the world because the saint is the decisive answer to the big riddle. What is a human being? The saint is the terrifying statement. Humans are sanctificabilis, capable of being sanctified, holiable. This word does not exist in our language. Why not, actually? But such a thing does exist. Humans are beings who can already partake of God's holiness in this mammalian body. Gores's remark is insightful. And I think that any person who has dared to break free from the mind-numbing superficiality of the world in which we live, from the nothingness that haunts human experience, I believe that such a person is doomed, or better, we might say fortunate enough to ask, who am I? What am I? If we just take the time to step away from the crippling and soul-crushing distractions that plague us, even if just for a minute, then almost inevitably, and this I can basically promise you, the restlessness, the uneasiness, the instability of our existence will surface and shout. And then we're going to start asking questions. We're going to start reflecting. Who am I? What am I? You know, when I was in Rome, when professors would be lecturing and then they would have a digression, they would say open parentheses. So I'm going to say right now, open parentheses, and I'm going to give a quick 2-3 sentence digression. I think today there's a very serious crisis of thought in the world. Namely, I don't think people think. Or at the least, I don't think people think deeply. And if this observation is accurate, it should scare us. What's the alternative? Right? If we don't think deeply, then we either think superficially or not at all. That should startle us. If we do not think coherently, then we think incoherently. That should startle us. If our thinking is not engaging reality, then what's it engaging? I think the crisis of thought is no minor crisis. Okay, close parentheses. So to the fundamental question, who am I? Gores sees a promising answer in the saints. More specifically, they answer the question, what is a human being? And what they reveal is that a human being is that animal that can be holy. This fact about human life changes the game. Think of it this way. If it is possible that this I can be holy, then there is no other adventure or enterprise worth taking. If the possibility of holiness is granted, then the basic destination of human striving has been revealed. Gores's point, the saints reveal us that holiness is in fact possible. And if it's possible, we've got the goal. So we are sanctificabilis, holiable. This feature, right, constitutive of what it means to be a human being, therefore implies a call, a vocation, something not yet realized, but something realizable. We are not, in other words, ready-made creatures. We need to be put together. We're kind of like an IKEA piece of furniture. You know, all the pieces are there, but how they fit together is certainly a mystery, but it is buildable. The saints ensure us you can be put together. And that being put together is holiness. Okay, Gores continues. This is number 2 on your handout, quotation number 2. She says, holiness belongs only to God. Wherever it is claimed by people, it is an expression that this person has been gripped by God, that divine life has broken into us. All human holiness is bestowed holiness. It is a reflection, and it is God's will that we receive this offer. When we meditate on, when we study the life of a saint, we're studying the holiness of a saint. And so what we're ultimately concerning ourselves with is the holiness of God. Holiness that has thus been bestowed. Pope Benedict XVI, he once wrote that through the saints, God reminds us of himself. Through the saints, God reminds us of himself. All right, let me try to make a couple of concluding remarks. I'm going to make 2 main points before moving on into the major legend. So these are going to prepare us, these 2 points are going to prepare us for what hagiography means, and then we'll talk about the major legend. But so basically, if in the saints we're looking at bestowed holiness, right, holiness that comes from God, then it follows that what we see in the concreteness, the particularity of this saint's life is the manner in which that bestowed holiness, right, has been expressed. We see the holiness that is proper to God expressed and manifest in various ways in various saints. The holiness, in other words, of God is, so to speak, contracted by the individual saint, and it's manifested in his or her individual life. The inexpressible, the inaccessible, inexpressible, infinite holiness of God has penetrated into the depths of this individual person's life and has found expression in her life, in his life. Okay, so here are the 2 points that follow from this reflection. The first point, I want to read one more quote from Gordes, and this is number 3 on your handout. All right. She writes, is it any wonder that the imitation of the saints, the striving for perfection, has time and again become more of an imitation of the frame, an imitation of the vessel, think like this individual saint, rather than of its inexpressible content, the holiness? Is it any wonder that this happens not even due to a superficial confusion, but from the really honest and to a certain extent also valid hope that a similar container, like me, would move God to fill it too with the same infusion? If you look at the history of the church, you sometimes get the impression that next to the true saint, who has always existed, something like a shadow has developed, who is just his earthly doppelganger. Not a false saint in the sense of the deceiver, he of course has also existed, but if I may say so, the ersatz saints, that means the substitute saints, the mere idea of the saint, the model images which adulterate this idea, and the pious who seek to realize such a model. This is what she's getting at. If all we try to do is to reduplicate Francis or any other saint, and I mean reduplicate kind of literally, then we've completely missed the point. What we're not after, in other words, we're not after the bestowed holiness in Francis. We're after simply bestowed holiness. We're not after Francis's holiness, because there is no such thing as Francis's holiness. All holiness is bestowed holiness. That's why saints in the history of the church, they break the mold. God's holiness doesn't readily fit into set patterns and formulas. So for instance, I can try in my life as a friar to literally reduplicate Francis, but I can assure you it won't automatically make me holy. I can say, Francis did X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Why aren't I holier now? That's not quite the right attitude to have with the saints. The logic shouldn't be, in other words, Francis did X, Francis was holy. Therefore, I'm going to do X, and therefore I'll be holy. Rather, the logic should be God made Francis holy, ergo, God can make me holy. Now, certainly, right? Certainly we can learn from the saints. Romano Guardini, he's a great 20th century theologian, one of my favorites. He says that the saints are explorers in the kingdom of God. They're men and women who blaze a trail which others can tread. Certainly, also, we can develop friendship with the saints. We can develop friendship with these men and women in whom God's love has blossomed. Certainly, in the saints, God reminds us of himself. But we don't try to reduplicate them one to one. That's not what they tell us to do. I want to share a passage of St. Francis, because as we begin to study his life, we should keep this in mind. This is number 4 on your handout. Let all of us, brothers, consider the good shepherd who bore the suffering of the cross to save his sheep. The Lord's sheep followed him in tribulation and persecution, in shame and hunger, in weakness and temptation, and in other ways. And for these things they received eternal life from the Lord. Therefore, it is a great shame for us, the servants of God, that the saints have accomplished great things, and we want only to receive glory and honor by recounting them. So we should have that in mind, that when we learn about St. Francis or any other saint, we're not just recounting what they did. The goal is to be inspired by them, to see that God bestowed holiness in them, and therefore holiness is possible for me. The second point I want to make is this, and here we're going to start moving into how we might understand hagiography. If it is the case that the holiness of the saint is bestowed holiness, and thereby a reflection of God who is, as we say every day at Mass, holy, 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 Lord God of hosts, then, and this is my suggestion, mere biography is not enough, right? So if in the saint we see the bestowed holiness of God, mere biography is not enough. In other words, certain events, certain people, they manifest a density, a gravity of being and mystery that what we see, what we perceive, what we observe cannot grasp the complete picture. Let me give you an example, because I think that this, what I just said, is not only applicable to the saints. Artists, poets, they understand exactly what I'm saying. Suppose I have a flower in front of me. It would be possible for me to describe to you the flower. I can tell you the size, I can tell you how many leaves it has, I can tell you the color, I can tell you how it's proportioned. But there's something more to the flower. A poet is not going to be satisfied with mere description. There's more to the flower. The poet tries to uncover the depths, uncover the unseen, uncover what's behind the flower, the depth of the flower's beauty. There is, in other words, a density to being in general that evades mere description. And if this is so, then isn't it even more so the case when we talk about saints, when we talk about the holiness that is God that has been bestowed on another? Herein lies the importance of hagiography. So etymologically, biography has to do with, graph, right? The second part of that word has to do with writing, and bios is life. So it has to do with the writing of a life, biography. Hagiography, okay, same thing, except it's hagios, not bios. Hagios has to do with holiness. So hagiography is a written account of the holiness of someone. And historically, hagiographies are generally written to increase devotion to a saint. So after a clearly holy person has died, people would take it upon themselves to write a hagiography so that people could learn about the holiness of this person and their devotion would grow. So the goal is not to give a biographical account of this person's life, but to draw attention to and explicate the holiness of this saint. But here's the thing, in today's world, right, if you pick up the major legend of St. Francis, it's going to look a little fantastical. It might seem like a fairy tale. The events, the miracles, it's just simply too much. It's exaggerated. It can't be taken seriously. Almost inevitably, I think today we're kind of doomed to read a hagiography like that. But here I want to push back, okay? So I want to make a distinction for you. I think that we can speak of historical accuracy, and I think that we can speak of theological accuracy. Both are super important when we're talking about a saint. We want to know the historical details of his or her life, but there's also a theological dimension to the saint. And I think what the author of hagiography is trying to do is the second part of that, the theological interpretation. We'll talk about the third lecture of this series. We're going to look at how St. Bonaventure discusses the stigmata of St. Francis. And St. Bonaventure draws from previous lives of St. Francis that were written, but he also adds new elements when he describes the stigmata of St. Francis. And so immediately one might ask, oh, is he making that up? Is he a fabulist? This isn't what historically happened. Well, that's one way we might take it. Or we can say what Bonaventure is doing in that instance is he is writing as a theologian, and he wants to get the accurate picture of what happened to St. Francis beyond which the eye could see. Just as a poet thinks poetically, Bonaventure is at times going to think theologically. So when we read hagiography, when we read a life of a saint, we need to keep this in mind. And this should strike us as obvious. If you've never read poetry before, it's going to be difficult to pick up a book of poetry. If you've never read plays before, you're going to struggle to read the plays of Shakespeare, right? It requires training to learn how to read different types of texts. And so we should be patient with hagiography, with the major legend of St. Francis, if at times it strikes us as maybe exaggerated. All right. Now, we can start making our way into the major legend, all right, of St. Francis. But I can't help myself. We need to say a few words about context. What is this? When was it, right? What is it? So my goal in this lecture series is to introduce you to Bonaventure's major legend. I hope in so doing, we get a clearer picture of St. Francis. Ultimately, my hope is that we draw closer to St. Francis, that our devotion to him grows. He is our brother and the mystical body of Christ who can help us. And so I don't want to spend too much time on historical context, but I do want to say just a few words about it so we have some idea of the situation behind the text. So St. Bonaventure, he was, we might say, a second generation Franciscan. He would have never have met St. Francis. St. Francis died in 1226, and St. Bonaventure died in 1274. So by the time St. Bonaventure joined the Franciscans, St. Francis was already dead. Bonaventure was born in the early 13th century. He was educated at Paris. and then he joined the friars. He was one of the most respected theologians in the church at that time. Eventually, he was elected what's called the Minister General of the Order, kind of the top boss of the order. Okay. And it was as Minister General that he was asked to write the major legend. He wrote this probably in 1261. So, like just over 30 years after Francis died. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there were other lives of St. Francis. And so Bonaventure writes this text precisely because there's so much literature out there and there's a need for some sort of standard. Like, what's the normative text we friars can go to? There was a need, and he responded to this need. There's also a liturgical need. So, especially in the Middle Ages, it would not have been uncommon for a life of a saint to be read during the celebration of an octave of the saint, or to be read during liturgy, or to be read during meals. And so the friars needed a text that they could read. But there's also another reason why St. Bonaventure wrote this. Bonaventure, in the prologue to the major legend, he identifies Francis as a man worthy of complete imitation. In other words, what's important for Bonaventure is not just that we know about Francis. What's important is that we're acting like him, that the text moves us, that the text forms us. And so Bonaventure writes a formative document. He wants his brothers in the order to be properly formed, and he's going to use Francis as a model. Objection. Objection. Does this not go against what I said earlier? That we shouldn't try to reduplicate the saints. Well, let me defend that. Let me defend my position. I don't think that's what Bonaventure is trying to get at. I don't think he's saying we need to reduplicate what Francis did. And one of the reasons why I think that is because Bonaventure did not reduplicate Francis's life. He lived a rather different life than St. Francis. And Francis himself, at his deathbed, says, I have done what is mine. May Christ teach you to do what is yours. I have done what is mine. May Christ teach you to do what is yours. Don't just reduplicate me. So I don't think Bonaventure thinks we should reduplicate Francis's life, but he thinks Francis is worthy of imitation insofar as he was a man of, to use Bonaventure's own phrase, gospel perfection. That is what should be imitated. Gospel perfection. We are all called to a form of gospel perfection in our lives. Okay, let me anticipate another objection. Does this remark about imitating Francis not diminish the importance of Christ? Why Francis? Shouldn't we just imitate Christ? Again, taking it that way would certainly be wrong. Christ obviously is the model. Obviously. St. Francis wanted his brothers to follow in the footprints of Jesus Christ and to live the gospel of Jesus Christ. He was adamant about that and clear about that. That's the form, that's the shape of Franciscan life. Bonaventure draws attention to Francis precisely because he lived that life. We don't follow Francis because of Francis. We follow Francis because of who Francis followed. And ultimately, Francis entered into an unfathomable union with Christ at the end of his life, the stigmata. So we look at Francis in order to live like he did as a man who followed Christ wholeheartedly. Indeed, more than any other life of St. Francis, St. Bonaventure's life stresses evangelical perfection. Francis was a man of evangelical perfection, gospel perfection. All right. At long last, we can get into the text. So the major legend is 15 chapters. And here's what I'm going to do. The first 4 chapters are kind of chronological. They go through the life of Francis. The next 5 through 12 are more thematic. They talk about different virtues of St. Francis's life. And then the final 13 to 15 are about the stigmata, more chronological, more narrative. So today I want to talk about those first 4 chapters, which are chronological. Next week, we'll focus on the thematic section, the virtues of St. Francis, and then the final week, the end of St. Francis's life. I'm going to read to you the very opening words of the prologue. The grace of God our Savior has appeared in these last days in his servant Francis, to all who are truly humble and lovers of holy poverty, who, while venerating in him God's superabundant mercy, learn by his example to reject wholeheartedly ungodliness and worldly passions, to live in conformity with Christ, and to thirst after blessed hope with unflagging desire. Bonaventure, in these opening lines, signals to the reader, to us, the goal of this text, that we might learn by Francis's example to reject ungodliness and worldly passions, to live in conformity with Christ, and to thirst after hope. We reject something, we live in conformity with Christ, and we hope for where we're going. Bonaventure then doubles down on this idea of Francis as an example. He says that God gave Francis as a light for believers, a practitioner, a leader, and a herald of what? Of gospel perfection. That by bearing witness to the light, he might prepare for the Lord a way of light and peace to the hearts of his faithful. So Francis is a practitioner, a leader, a herald of gospel perfection. Note the insistence, the emphasis on gospel. For Bonaventure, what we see in Francis is gospel life. He is thus, Bonaventure goes on to say, an example for the perfect followers of Christ. Bonaventure basically tells us, if you want to see what the gospel looks like, look at this man. He lived it out to the full. Chapter 1 of the text is entitled St. Francis's Manner of Life in the Attire of the World. Francis did not grow up a saint. The earlier lives of St. Francis, those written before St. Bonaventure, emphasize his worldly character even more so than St. Bonaventure. Bonaventure is a little bit more restrained. I think he has too much devotion to St. Francis to make him appear like too much of a party animal in Assisi. But he does state clearly that Francis lived among foolish children of mortals, and was brought up in foolish ways. He grew up the son of a merchant, and the merchant class wasn't a class of nobility, but it was kind of like the rising class of nobles. Okay. Francis was inevitably drawn to profit. He would have come from a very wealthy family. But when you read this opening chapter of Bonaventure's life, there's a sense that in Francis, there's something stirring inside of him. There's a restlessness inside of him. Something in him that oriented him, whether he knew it or not, to God. The parties, the profit, the dress, it wasn't enough. One night, Francis has a dream. And in this dream, the divine kindness showed him a large, splendid palace with military arms, emblazoned with the insignia of the cross. Francis asks in the dream to whom these belong, and he receives a response that all these things were for him and his knights. Bonaventure continues, therefore, on waking up in the morning, since he was not yet disciplined in penetrating the divine mysteries and did not know how to pass through the visible appearance to contuit the invisible truth, he assessed the unusual vision to be a judgment of great prosperity in the future. So let me just say a couple things here. First, knighthood, Francis wanted. He desired knighthood. Okay, he might not be a nobleman, right? Part of the aristocracy, but he's got money, and he's going to ensure that he is truly awesome by becoming a knight. So when he sees this vision, of course he's going to take it. This is my lot in life. I knew it. This is why the parties were never enough. I'm supposed to be a knight. I'm going to be glorious. But the other thing, Bonaventure says Francis didn't quite understand the vision. He couldn't contuit the truth behind it. So this is a word that is very personal to St. Bonaventure, contuitio in Latin. And what Bonaventure means by this is, it's kind of like this. Bonaventure thinks that if you see the world rightly, you should also have a concomitant, so a simultaneous, oblique glance of God. So there's a sense in Bonaventure that there's a deeper truth behind the visible realities that we see. And we don't perceive them with our eyes, but we contuit them. Okay, so Francis couldn't contuit the truth of this vision. So he doesn't read the dream correctly. He takes it as a sign of his own prosperity, and then he sets out to Apulia, which is a city not too far from Assisi, in order to be a knight himself. Right? He's going to go to war. Clearly, speaking historically, when we study the life of St. Francis, something happened on the way to Apulia. This experience of him going to Apulia with the hope of becoming a knight is standard. Well, once again, at night, something happens. Francis hears a voice. Francis, who can do more for you, a lord or a servant? This is a famous question among Franciscans. We all know it, that Francis was asked, who can do more for you, a lord or a servant? Francis replies, as any of us would, obviously the Lord. Obviously the Lord of the house could do more for me than a servant. And then he gets the following response. Why then are you abandoning the Lord for a servant and the rich God for a poor mortal? I think we would do well to reflect on this question in our own life. Why are you abandoning the Lord for a servant? Why are you abandoning the rich God for a poor mortal? So this experience initiates a change in the life of St. Francis. There's beginning in him a deeper and deeper desire to serve the Lord. His heart's beginning to be inflamed, but he does not really know how to do what it is that this newfound desire has begun to seek. He wants to be a knight of Christ, but how? Francis's conversion is further enkindled in this chapter by a vision of Christ on the cross. So already we should see in this first chapter, the crucified becomes a key element of the spiritual life of St. Francis. Francis, from early on in his conversion, is drawn to the crucified. His soul, Bonaventure says, melted at the sight, and the memory of Christ's passion was so impressed on the innermost recesses of his heart. And then, and this is precisely what encountering does, Francis begins to orient himself to others, to lepers, to poor beggars, to poor priests. He encounters Christ on the cross, and what is he led to do? Serve others. Chapter 2 of the major legend, right? So we have his conversion. He hasn't quite figured out where he's going, but the conversion is there. And chapter 2 is called his perfect conversion to God and his repair of 3 churches. So in this chapter, we have the great experience before the San Damiano crucifix. This is one of, personally, my favorite scenes in the life of St. Francis. And still today, if you go to Assisi, you can visit in the Basilica of St. Clare the San Damiano crucifix, which is always it's very touching to pray before that cross, this cross that radically changed Francis's life. The way that I approach this story is the way we might think of a superhero's origin story. So if you really want to know a superhero, you got to look at the origin story. Why is this superhero the way he or she is? So you go back to the origins. I think this is Francis's origin story. I'm going to read to you the scene as St. Bonaventure writes it. For one day, when Francis went out to meditate in the fields, he walked near the church of San Damiano, which was threatening to collapse because of age. Impelled by the Spirit, he went inside to pray. Prostrate before an image of the crucified, he was filled with no little consolation as he prayed. While his tear-filled eyes were gazing at the Lord's cross, he heard, with his bodily ears, a voice coming from that cross, telling him 3 times, "Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you see, is all being destroyed." Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you see, is all being destroyed. Francis, go and rebuild my house, which, as you see, is all being destroyed. This is Francis's mission. Go and repair my house. For me, this is essential to the whole Franciscan vocation. What are we friars? We're carpenters. We are gospel carpenters, or at least we should be. Our business is in rebuilding. We're called to rebuild the church. Now, Francis, he's still not super good at reading visions correctly. So he takes this very literally, as in literal rebuilding of churches. Now, later, he realized what this meant, that what Christ was telling him was to rebuild the church, the body of Christ that is the church. And so when we think about St. Francis, and I think this is important, because I think popular visions of St. Francis get this wrong almost all of the time. When we think about St. Francis, we need to understand that his mission was inseparable from the church. Francis was not some hippie who lived outside of the church. He was a very faithful son of the church, intent on being so faithful that he could repair it, that he could attend to the sins of the church, that he could repair those areas in the life of the church that are broken. That's fundamental to his vision. Where is it being destroyed? That's where you should find a son of St. Francis. At least that's the goal. There's another important scene in this chapter. So Francis's father was a wealthy merchant, right? And you can imagine this very wealthy merchant who has a wonderful business that spans all the way to France is excited to raise his son in the family business. And now all of a sudden, Francis is acting very, very strange. Not the kind of guy you might want to hand over your business to. There's a disagreement between Francis and his father, and this disagreement grows so big that it leads to the bishop. They arrive before the bishop, before his house in Assisi, in the courtyard. And before the bishop, Francis strips. He gets totally naked. When you read the life of St. Francis, actually, you get the impression that he kind of liked to be naked. The nudity of Francis is a theme. And it's an interesting theme, not just in his lives, but in other lives of the saints. The idea is that they are naked following the naked Christ. That Christ, who is naked on the cross, has nothing for himself. And so the saints have nothing for themselves. And so as Francis is before his father and before the bishops, he strips completely naked and he says, "Until now I have called you Father here on earth, but now I can say without reservation, our Father who art in heaven." since I've placed all my treasure and all my hope in him. So he gave up his inheritance, and the bishop comes and covers him up to stop scandalizing the rest of the townspeople. One more point in this chapter that's important for the life of Francis. Francis discovers the Portiuncula. What's that? The Portiuncula, little portion. The Portiuncula is a little chapel. You can still visit it in Assisi. There's a giant basilica, and then you go inside the basilica, and in the middle of the basilica, there's a small chapel, the Portiuncula. Francis discovered this small chapel, and he fell in love with it. He built it up, right? He's literally rebuilding churches. This is the third church he builds up. And he interprets these three churches, Bonaventure interprets these three churches symbolically. They're going to represent the threefold way in which Francis would repair the church by the form, rule, and teaching of Christ that Francis would provide. And so Bonaventure sees in these three churches a kind of anticipation of what Francis is going to do, rebuild the church by the life he envisions. It's 8 o'clock. Do I have, can I have like 7 more minutes? Okay, so.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, all right, we'll finish chapter 3 and 4 then. So chapter 3 now is about the founding of the rule. So Francis, he had his origin story. All right, this is the mission, and now there's going to start being some we might say institutionalization. He's going to put the pieces together now, all right? Francis, at the Portiuncula, begs the Mother of God to be his advocate. We should note the importance of this. Francis had a profoundly deep devotion to Our Lady. And if I may, I like to think of the Franciscans as Mary's favorite order. And here's why. Because the Immaculate Conception was really first defended by a Franciscan. So, I mean, come on. That's pretty legit. So Francis had a huge devotion to Our Lady, and while at the Portiuncula, which is a small chapel dedicated to Our Lady, he begs her intercession. And then Bonaventure turns to a specific event. One day, he says, and he recounts how Francis heard the gospel passage where Christ sends out his disciples to preach, and he instructs them not to keep any gold or any money, not to have any wallet or shoes or staff, right? You know that gospel passage. Go out and don't take anything with you for the journey. Francis, after hearing this, it's like his heart woke up, and he says, this is what I want. This is what I desire with all my heart. Now, make the connections. In the previous chapter, we had the origin story. Go, repair my church. And now in this chapter, we have the how. How is the church going to be repaired? Through the gospel life. Francis now becomes a model. He's growing into a model of evangelical perfection. He begins to invite others to do penance with him, to do penance, to turn their life around. The order, the fraternity is beginning. A first follower joins Francis, Bernard. And with Bernard, the form of life that Francis envisions continues to unfold, continues to become more concrete, more solidified. So he sits down with Bernard, and they open up the gospel 3 times. And these are the passages they get. If you will be perfect, go sell all that you have and give to the poor. Take nothing on your journey. If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Francis comes to each of these passages, and after the third one, he says, this is our life. This is our rule. And Bonaventure tells us that Francis placed the observance of the Holy Gospel as its unshakable foundation. We might recall here just how unique this vision is. So before Francis, the mainstream, really the only form of religious life in the church was monastic. And monastic life follows a very, very concrete rule. So if you go back to Saint Benedict, when Saint Benedict founded his order of monks, his rule is so practical from the first page to the last. It tells about when the monks are to pray, how they are to pray, what they are to do when they're not praying, what kind of work they are to do, the general horarium, the schedule of each day. Everything is laid out. And then Francis, what's his rule? What's the gospel? In some ways, there's a profound impracticability of Francis's rule, which might drive friars crazy, right? Well, what are we to do? We're supposed to live the gospel. That's the rule. All right, Francis is not, however, just content to write something down and live it. He's not content to say, all right, our rule is the gospel. All right, let's go, Bernard. Let's go get more guys. Let's go live the gospel. Remember, Francis is a son of the church. He wants to go get permission from the Pope. He knows that what he's envisioning is new, but he's not going to do anything without the Pope's permission. So he goes to Rome, and some cardinals are concerned with what Francis is bringing to the table. Now, you can imagine that Francis is in a habit that's much probably dirtier than that of Brother Ross's. Hopefully he was in a habit. We remember that he kind of liked to take it off at times. So hopefully he didn't go up to St. Peter's without a habit. But he was probably looking very scruffy, probably wasn't that clean, and he's coming to give this idea to the Pope to live the gospel. Some cardinals are justifiably a little concerned. And then this is what one of the cardinals says, though. He says, listen, if we refuse the request of this poor man as novel or as too difficult, when all he asks is to be allowed to lead the gospel life, we must be on our guard lest we commit an offense against Christ's gospel. We can't say no. For if anyone says that, I'm reading from the text, if anyone says that there is something novel or irrational or impossible to observe in this man's desires to live according to the perfection of the gospel, he would be guilty of blasphemy against Christ, the author of the gospel. The cardinal realizes, wait a second, we can't say no. All he's asking us is to live the gospel. One final little detail that's cool about this chapter, because it's a neat experience. Before Francis gets to Rome, the Pope had a vision of the Lateran Basilica. And if you go to Rome, the main church in Rome isn't St. Peter's. The main church is St. John Lateran. That's really the Pope's church, right? That's the center church of the Roman church. And the Pope had a vision of the Lateran church falling down, and he sees a poor friar, a poor man holding the church so that it doesn't fall down. The Pope realizes after his encounter with Francis that this is the poor man I saw in my dream, the little poor man who's going to hold up Christ's church by what he does and by what he teaches. By what he does and by what he teaches. Notice that theme, repair my house. Okay, the last chapter, and then I'm done. The last chapter is on the progress of the order. If to a certain degree the order was born in the Portiuncula, remember the little chapel, then it grows also in the Portiuncula. So Francis, eventually after Rome, he makes his way back to the Portiuncula with his brothers, so that by the merits of the Mother of God, can you hear that Marian devotion? By the merits of the Mother of God, it might also begin to grow with her assistance. From this church, Francis goes forth and preaches. His preaching is attractive, it's powerful, it's impactful, so others begin to draw more and more into the brotherhood. This is what Bonaventure says. He writes, "For set on fire by the fervor of his preaching, a great number of people bound themselves by new laws of penance, according to the rule which they received from the man of God. Christ's servant decided to name this way of life the Order of the Friars of Penance." And then it's in this context, in this chapter, where we meet St. Clare. That would be another lecture on beautiful St. Clare, who was attracted to the gospel life of St. Francis, and who, with Francis, founded the Poor Clares. And still to this day, you can go to the Basilica of St. Clare in Assisi and hear the Clares, the Poor Clares, pray. Bonaventure continues, "Many people as well, not only driven by devotion, but also inflamed by a desire for the perfection of Christ, once they had condemned the emptiness of everything worldly, followed the footsteps of Francis." I just want to reflect on that, the emptiness of everything worldly. The Latin for the word emptiness is the same word for vanity. And this is an important term for Bonaventure. When he has a commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes, "Oh, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And he takes that and he interprets that as meaning the emptiness of the world, the nothingness of the world. Bonaventure thinks that we are created from nothing, right? And therefore, there's kind of this natural, inevitable inclination in us towards nothingness. If it wasn't for God holding us in existence, we would evaporate. And so we have an inclination towards the nothingness of the world. I think, personally, we would do well to reflect at length on this. I think one of the great trials today is to reawaken ourselves to this nothingness. It's so easy to be distracted from it. So easy to be distracted from the feeling of the nothingness of the world, to blind ourselves to it. We can put a phone in front of our eyes and, whew, all right, I don't feel the nothingness anymore. But conversion unfolds, according to Bonaventure here, precisely when we acknowledge the nothingness of the world. If you think there's something out there, just wait. Wait on your conversion. Don't try to be converted yet when you think there's something out there in the world. There's nothingness out there, says Bonaventure. And only when we see that can we make an about face. Conversion unfolds precisely when we become aware of the nothingness of the world. And might I add, it's painful to become aware of the nothingness of the world. So as the order grows, that was a big open and close parentheses. But as the order grows, Francis desires that this life now be more formally and permanently confirmed by the Pope. So previously he kind of got like oral confirmation from the Pope, but now he really, now it's time. This life needs to be official. And so at the conclusion of this chapter, Francis writes the rule. All the orders live by a rule. There's the rule of St. Benedict, the rule of St. Augustine, the rule of St. Francis. And as we read Bonaventure describing this, yet again, what do we hear? The gospel. The rule, as written by Francis, as envisioned by Francis, is substantially, fundamentally, essentially the gospel. That's his desire. And Francis is led by the Spirit in all of this. Bonaventure stresses this detail. Francis is led by the Spirit. What's interesting is in Francis's own writings, we hear that over and over again. Francis always talks about being led by the Spirit of the Lord. That the Spirit of the Lord should be operating within us. Bonaventure sees that at play in Francis. Francis's desire and vision is inflamed and guided by the Spirit. The next chunk of chapters we'll do next week. And the next chunk of chapters give us what I would call the contours of St. Francis's life. What was he like? Right. So I hope this first talk, I apologize, maybe it was a little bit long, but we get an idea of the significance of the saints. We have an idea now of why hagiography is important, and hopefully we have a basic idea of the beginnings of Francis's life and the founding of the order. So thank you very much.
Thank you.